Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Good day to all of you, and thanks so much for joining us in the Word this morning. We're back in the Old Testament where we were during our last lesson, back near the end of the period of the Judges. We had a lesson last time around from 1 Samuel. Samuel was the last of the great judges of Israel. And we're going to have two lessons now from the wonderful, delightful book of Ruth, which also took place during the period of Judges. We're back on the covenant theme here, and it's a rather different kind of covenant. It's not exactly a covenant between God and the Israelite people, the covenant people. Yeah. It's a very personal kind of covenant, isn't it?
Our lesson title is a mother-daughter covenant.
Yeah. Last lesson, we were talking about Jonathan and David, which was also an interpersonal covenant, a friendship covenant. Yeah. And now, technically speaking, this isn't a mother-daughter, is it? Right. We're talking about Naomi and Ruth, the two main characters of the book of Ruth. And technically, they were a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law.
Right.
So, did the lesson writers miss the boat on the title, do you think?
Well, not exactly, because as we read the text, it's obvious that Naomi considered Ruth as a daughter, and Ruth, in making her choice to go with Naomi, really was making a voluntary adult commitment to adoption, as it were. I mean, it's an informal, but essentially she becomes a part of Naomi's family.
Accepts her motherhood, and Naomi takes responsibility for Ruth's personal life and relations, adopts her family, adopts her faith. So that's interesting. A mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship kind of evolves into something very lovely.
A mother-daughter.
Yeah, a mother-daughter relationship.
And it's really, as we're going to look at the lesson and the implications of it, it isn't limited to the females of the family. It's a parent-child covenant that we're going to be talking about.
And there are implications here for all kinds of interpersonal covenants as well, including our relationship with God. I find it interesting that the root meaning of the Hebrew word for mother-in-law is wall, implying a wall of protection. And that is definitely what Naomi does here, right? She puts herself in the place of the protector and caregiver for her daughter-in-law, for whom, in some ways, she doesn't have technically any responsibility. But I think that's a lovely way to think about her.
Yeah, but the historical setting in the time of the Judges is significant because it was, we mentioned before, it was a chaotic time, and it really was. The judges, some of the judges, you think, not very noble characters.
Right. And it was an era characterized by immorality and idolatry. And that's why the book of Ruth, the story of Ruth, is like a candle in a dark, dark place, shining a light of moral commitment and love for one another and faithfulness.
Fidelity,
and faithfulness to God.
Right. Yeah.
Because as we're going to see, Naomi not only remains faithful to Yahweh, but Ruth becomes
that. And it's an insight into the fact that the foreigners, the despised foreigners of the time, can have people who are really significant and strong characters of faith.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because another characteristic of the period of Judges that lies lurking behind this story is the hostility of the Israelites with the surrounding nations. They had driven many of them out. They didn't wipe them out, but they drove them out of the center. But those those tribal groups were always trying to press back in
Yes.
to the territory that Joshua had conquered. And our viewers are going to recognize the names: Philistines, Ammonites,
Moabites,
Bashanites, Canaanites. The judges were continually fighting these tribal groups and nations that lived around them. And our story relates to the Moabites, who lived very close to the people of Judah. They were just right across the Jordan and the Dead Sea.
Yeah.
And not only were they in proximity, but some of the greatest hostility was with the Moabites.
Yes, yeah.
When the Israelites were ending their years in the wilderness and coming up to the borders of the Promised Land, they encamped in Moab, and thousands of them fell into sexual immorality with Moabite women and idolatry with Moabite gods.
Yeah.
And the reaction was fierce
Yeah.
to that. And then during the period of the Judges, it's as
Balak and Balaam.
Yeah, even before they got there. That's
Yes,
right. I
yeah.
skipped over Balak and Balaam. Balak hired this prophet to curse
Right.
the Israelites and keep them out of Moab. And then I was jumping ahead to the period of the Judges, where the judge Ehud sneaks into Moab and assassinated their king.
Yeah, their fat king.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a history of hostility, immorality, idolatry in their connection with Moab. And so this story just stands in such beautiful contrast to
It really
that.
does.
Yeah. Well, what about the first 5 verses of Ruth that are skipped over? Our printed text starts at verse 6.
Yeah.
Let's catch ourselves up on what we've missed there.
Well, it indicates it was the days of the judges, but there was a famine in the land. And there had been famines numerous times. Clear back when Abram first came with Sarai, there was a famine that sent them to Egypt. And
so this is a
later
fairly
on,
normal climatological
this seems
cycle,
to be a
right?
cycle thing.
Yeah, there's no sense here that this is a punishment.
No, Isaac had to go because of a famine. Eventually, Jacob took the family where Joseph was because of a famine. So there was a famine, and Elimelech, who was an Ephrathite, that is, he came from Bethlehem of Judah, and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons fled the land because of hunger and went to the enemy territory of Moab.
It's an indication of just how desperate they were for their lives, that they would have fled the famine and left Judah, the southern Palestine, into enemy territory.
And
survive.
That kind of survival mode we're seeing in modern times with the people of the Near East, of Syria and Iraq and various places, and even our southern border, people fleeing terrible situations, looking for survival.
Right. And going to places that they otherwise would have feared to go, probably,
Right.
and where they're not welcome.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. They appeared to have settled down, though, and made their home quite happily in
expected
Moab.
to be there. The 2 sons found wives.
Yeah, which is a little surprising, given the attitude of Israelites toward Moabites. But they find wives there and stayed for 10 years.
Total of 10 years.
Yeah.
Naomi was the only one that survived the full 10 years.
That's true.
But her husband Elimelech died. The 2 sons who'd taken wives both died.
Yeah.
So
Mahlon and Chilion were the sons' names, and it's interesting. Mahlon means sickly, and Chilion means destruction. So their names kind of indicate they shouldn't have
doomed.
expected longevity. At any rate, the story we are presented when we come to chapter 1 then is the story of 3 widows.
yes.
Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth.
And they've drawn together in mutual misery, apparently, to the point where they become like daughters to Naomi.
Yeah. And she became to them their wall of protection. All right. Well, why don't you read their story for us?
Okay, beginning at verse 6 through 11 and then 14 through 18, Ruth chapter 1. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, She and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands?" Then verse 14. At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her.
Well, that's just the beautiful beginning of a wholly beautiful story.
It really is.
Ruth is just the most gorgeous light in the midst of the darkness.
Yeah.
Back to verse 6, where our printed text starts, word comes to Naomi in Moab that her homeland has now been relieved of the famine that had seized it for a long time. The word there that's translated food is actually the word bread, which is interesting because there's a play on words going on here, isn't there?
Bethlehem
is
the house of bread.
Right. Beit means house, and Lahem of the bread. So that was the hometown of Naomi.
Right.
We know it as the hometown of Jesus and the hometown of David, but the first
These
person
are their
we
ancestors.
meet, these are their ancestors.
Yeah.
And Naomi was from Bethlehem, house of bread. Well, the house of bread didn't have any bread for a while because of the famine. That's why they left. But now there's bread back in the house of bread. So she feels free and eager to return to her hometown. And she does, although we didn't see any sense that the famine had been sent by God as a kind of punishment, the provision of food now, of bread, is ascribed to God as part of God's divine provision and care for his people.
But she and the 2 daughters-in-law just begin to make the trek back to Judah.
Yeah, there's the sense that the daughters-in-law now feel socially connected to her more than to their biological families, and they just assume that if she returns, they will too.
Yeah.
But there's a lot at stake there in that decision. They're going to a place they've never been before. They're going to a place where they're going to be foreigners, aliens, strangers, different culture. Even though they've been living among Israelites for the last 10 years, it's still not the same as going back to Israel. So there's a lot at stake. And verse 7 sounds like everything is in process. They're
on the road,
headed back to Judah, which wasn't all that far in a way.
Not the distance, and yet it's a different world.
Culturally speaking, that's a good point, and religion and everything else.
Yeah.
Now, verse 8 shows us that Naomi, who had every reason to expect her daughters-in-law to stay with her and care for her in her advancing age, but Naomi has a sweet spirit about her, and she's thinking more for the sake of the daughters-in-law than for herself.
Right, and tells them, you need to go back. These are your people. This is your place. You've got your own families. Go to your mother's home.
Yeah.
But and she talks about the Lord may grant you'll find rest in the home of another man, a husband. You'll get married.
Yeah, and that's probably why she mentions the mother's home there. The mother would have taken responsibility for finding a husband. And so go back and let your mother find you another husband. And verse 9, as you said, that word rest surely means the consolation and care of a second marriage with another husband. These words, though, in verses 8 and 9 are just an absolute gorgeous blessing.
Right.
So, some things that we should note in the wording of the blessing, the use of the word Lord, meaning Yahweh, the distinctive covenant name of God, and that's going to be interesting. We're not surprised that Naomi uses the covenant name for God, but there is going to be a surprise a little later on.
We see Ruth use
it. When Ruth uses that word. The other thing in this blessing in 8 and 9 is the word kindness, which is that a distinctive word associated with the Israelite covenant with God, chesed, which we've talked about, and Dr. Gwaltney taught us about on so many wonderful occasions, which it's a word that almost defies translation, and as a result, English translations use a whole variety of terms: mercy, kindness, steadfast
loving
love,
kindness.
The King James, I still love loving kindness.
Yeah, I do too,
covenant loyalty.
Steadfast love.
Did I say mercy? And at any rate, so many different translations. But it has this idea of covenant commitment in it. So may the Lord show you, my non-Israelite daughters-in-law, covenant commitment. It's an interesting, and Naomi, is aware that their kindnesses have been shown not only to her in the intervening years of their widowhood, but they showed kindness to Naomi's daughters, that is, their husbands, who are now deceased. And she remembers that. And then the second part of the blessing is a wish that God grant them husbands, as you were saying.
And some of the verses that are left out later, she says, if I were to go back and find a husband myself, which she said I'm too old to that, but if I did, you think I'm going to have children? If I had children, would you wait for them? You're going
to wait for 18 or 20 years.
So you need to go back and get your own husbands.
And she acts in the latter part of verse 9, assuming that they're going to accept her offer to go back. She kisses them and says farewell, and there's weeping and from a parting. I mean, after all, they've been living intimately with one another for many years now, and they refuse her offer.
Verse 10, we'll go back with you to your people.
Now the word "your people" might be an indication that they're doing this just out of personal loyalty to Naomi, that they don't feel like they've really been incorporated into the people of Israel, and they haven't
yet. They're still foreigners,
But I feel like this is a very sincere commitment on their part in verse 10. I read one commentary on this verse that suggested that they felt like they had to say this.
Polite.
This was the play. If somebody says, "Oh, you don't have to go back with me," the first thing that a polite person would have to say is, "Oh, sure, we'll go back with you," but they don't really want to. And they're just waiting for the person to say a second or third time, "Yes, I really want you to go back." And then they'll say, "Oh, okay, I'll go back." Now, and maybe that's going on here. I don't. Do you get that?
With Orpah, at least, it might have been.
It might have been, but I don't want to assume, even in Orpah's part, that this was an insincere offer.
It sounds sincere,
Now, when Naomi insists and says in verse 11, "No, I really mean it. I don't need you guys to go back with me to Judah. I want you to go home." At that point, Orpah does relent and eventually go back.
Talking about Orpah, we probably ought to mention a famous person's mother decided to name her Orpah and misspelled it on the birth certificate, and it came out Oprah.
So the famous television personality and philanthropist Oprah Winfrey was intended to be called Orpah
right.
from this story, and her name got misspelled, and the rest is history of Oprah.
So even though Orpah went back, she's not left us in thought.
Right. We still have a version of Orpah even today. Before we leave verse 11, where Naomi reiterates her desire for them to stay in Moab, I wanted to point out that rather than use the word daughter-in-law, she's using the word daughters there. And that's the point that you were making earlier, that Ruth has kind of become a true daughter. Although we probably shouldn't think of daughters-in-law as kind of second-class citizens in the Israelite family. You know, we make so many jokes
in-laws
about in-laws and mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, which I find tiresome, frankly. I don't think we should make fun of that relationship the way we do, but we do. In that culture, they did not make fun of that relationship. I mentioned earlier that the word for mother-in-law has this root of wall of protection. I forgot to mention at that time, so I'll say it now, the word daughter-in-law, the root of that word is completion. So families viewed daughters-in-law as that which kind of filled out their family. Brought their family to completion. So this was a relationship that was very dear in Israelite culture. The mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship, and not one to be mocked.
In marriage, you become part of that family. And that's really what it's about.
Well, Ruth, verse 14 says, did not follow Orpah in her decision to stay in Moab, but clung to Naomi. That's an interesting word, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Tell us about it.
It comes up in Genesis 2:24 that a man shall leave his, and they'll cling to each other, cleave to one another.
A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. That's the word, that word joined.
Joined.
The King James used the word cleave. So he leaves his family and cleaves to his wife. Here, Ruth is leaving her Moabite family and cleaving to Naomi.
She's putting her life into this family all the way.
Right.
That's why I was saying it's almost like an adult voluntary adoption, that she's becoming a part of Naomi and Naomi's people. And the commitment that she makes is a pledge, and that's where our lesson title uses the term covenant. It really is. It's an oath that she takes as far as her pledging herself to Naomi.
First she makes a promise, and then she seals it with an oath. The promise comes in verse 16, and it's some of the most beautiful words anywhere in Scripture, I think. Please stop urging me to leave you, she says, as she cleaves to her. And then she says, don't ask me to turn back from behind you, is literally what it says. In other words, kind of physically here, Naomi is taking the lead, Ruth is following behind her, literally. And she says, don't ask me to do that anymore. And then we get a fourfold promise. The first is to share her journey. Her place. Where you go, I will go. The second is to share her home. Where you stay, I will stay. The third is to share her people group, her nation, her people. Your people will be my people. And the fourth, most strikingly, is to share her faith.
Your God, my God. But she goes on beyond that, that even beyond life, where you die, I will die, there I will be buried, and may Yahweh deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates me and you.
And that's the oath. She swears an oath to seal the promise that she's made. May God deal with me harshly if I don't do that. And what she's promising there is that, assuming that Naomi precedes her in death, Ruth won't take that as an opportunity to go back to Moab either.
She's committed.
She's committed to stay there and care for her grave, to be there with her until her own death.
And that covenant commitment, we both indicated, this was sung at our weddings.
Yeah, back in the 1960s when we each married our wives, I don't think I ever went to a wedding in the 60s where these words were not read or sung.
Whither thou goest, I will go.
Yeah, entreat me not to leave thee. Whither thou goest, I will go. In fact, it was so common that I assumed these words came from the Bible in a marriage setting.
Yeah.
Because that's the only place I'd ever heard them.
Yeah.
And boy, was it a surprise to me when I realized it was about a mother-in-law
and a
daughter-in-law covenant,
right.
not the marriage covenant.
Yeah.
Although the words couldn't be more appropriate to a marriage covenant, could
right.
they?
It is a deeply committed covenant relationship, and as we were saying earlier, it's not just mother and daughter. It could be father son, and it's parent child, but it's even beyond that family connection. It's a deep commitment, a covenant commitment.
Yeah. And we mentioned it briefly, but it's worth saying again that these people are the ancestors of Jesus,
right?
Who is the covenant. You know, this is the new covenant in my blood, Jesus said. Jesus is the one who became the covenant bearer, and in a way, his ancestors are here in a very lovely, quiet, interpersonal way, foreshadowing the eternal covenant which Jesus would eventually bring, and would be sealed by God's Spirit.
Yeah, you know, this whole experience of Naomi telling the daughters-in-law to go back, and Ruth saying, "No, I'm going with you," and making this kind of commitment, makes me think about the reality that all parents have to let their children go and urge their children to make their own choices, their own commitments. And there's a risk involved in that. They may turn away.
Well, Orpah did turn away,
right,
and Ruth did not. So
but
it's a real choice.
Unless they make that commitment, their own faith covenant, they're not likely to stay with it anyway. And I think some of the young adult falling away maybe because there's just been an assumption, the family's here, I'm here, it's what we all believe. But it's got to be a deep commitment. This, your God is my God.
And all the more reason then we can celebrate when people make that kind of decision to place their lives in a covenant relationship with God, and one hopefully that's voluntary and that they'll keep no matter what other decisions people make.
Yeah.
That's a great point about the choice that's involved in covenant keeping and the risk that's involved in covenant keeping as well. Well, haven't you enjoyed this beautiful story of Ruth and Naomi? We get another opportunity to explore this beautiful book from the Old Testament next time when we look at the covenant relationship between Ruth and her new husband, Boaz. Hope you'll be with us then. We'll look forward to seeing you.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.